In 1945, three young Native American sisters vanished without a trace from an Indian boarding school located within the United States. In that turbulent, chaotic era, their disappearance went largely unnoticed by the general public. However, one person, their elder brother, never ceased his relentless search. For decades later, he was about to make a truly shocking discovery, a disturbing find that would overturn all perceptions and expose a grim truth about what truly happened during that tragic period of American history. The desert wind carried dust and deep regret through the deserted streets of Whisper Rock, New Mexico, as 58-year-old Thomas Red Elk sat leaning against his rusted 1971 van. It was 1985, and after 40 years of an exhausting search, he had finally stopped here, worn out, broken, and clinging to mere fragments of memories. Thomas, whose birth name was Ashki Yazzie, but who was christened Tommy at the boarding school, reverently unfolded a yellowed newspaper onto his lap, as if it were a sacred relic. The sheet was 40 years old, yet he treated it as if it had been printed just yesterday. The front page headline read, "Indian Boarding Schools, Forging America's Bright Future." Beneath, it was a photograph that had haunted his dreams for all those 4 decades. In the picture, 3 young girls sat on the wooden steps of a small chapel's porch. Their dark hair was neatly braided, and their white cotton dresses meticulously ironed and spotlessly clean for the cameras. Behind them, slightly out of focus, but unmistakably recognizable, stood a priest in a black cassock, holding a Bible. Thomas knew every minute detail of that photograph, as if it were etched into his memory. He remembered how Sarah's hands were neatly folded on her lap, how Naomi's left shoulder was slightly sloped from an old, long-ago injury, and little Eva's serious expression, which made her look much older than her 8 years. These are not their real names, of course. The boarding school had stripped them of that, as it had stripped them of everything else that constituted their true essence. Sarah was born Aji, meaning she flows around, a name chosen by their grandmother because the child arrived during the spring floods. Naomi was Alisai, meaning she is precious, and Eva bore the name Aylin, which translated to joy. They were his younger sisters, forcibly taken from their family in Cottonwood Bluffs when representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs arrived with their papers, false promises, and deception. Thomas took a large gulp of beer, letting the bitter liquid wash away the even more bitter memories that tormented his soul. He was only 14 when they came for the 4 children, using their father's arrest as a cynical justification. Their father had resisted when government officials tried to seize their ancestral lands, and their mother had died giving birth to Aylin, leaving the children vulnerable to the federal assimilation policy that swept through native lands like a devastating plague. Wards of the state, that's what they were called, as if orphanhood were some kind of blessing or gift. St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school became their prison for many years. Boys and girls were kept in strict isolation from each other, meaning Thomas rarely saw his sisters, except for mandatory morning mass and evening prayers. Even then, speaking to them in their native language was strictly forbidden, and any violation was punished with days of confinement in a damp basement or, even worse, brutal beatings that left marks hidden beneath their school uniforms. But the worst day, the day that still woke him in a cold sweat, came in 1945 when he was 18. World War II was drawing to a close, but discrimination against Native peoples remained as sharp and ruthless as ever. The school had been preparing for weeks for what they called a press visit. Thomas remembered how they lined up the children like merchandise in a store window, placing the youngest prominently because their wide eyes and frightened expressions looked good in photographs. His sisters were specifically chosen for the photo shoot because of what the priest called their innocent beauty and obvious fear, which the newspapers would undoubtedly interpret as reverence. Reporters arrived with their bulky cameras and notebooks, asking pre-scripted questions about gratitude and salvation, while the priests nodded approvingly, confirming every word. They took dozens of photographs, including the very one that now lay on Thomas's lap. The next day, his sisters disappeared. He first realized it during morning mass, when their usual seats in the girls' section remained empty. When evening prayer came and they still hadn't appeared, panic seized him, an icy terror gripping his heart. He desperately questioned the guardians about his sisters, but they flatly refused to answer. Instead, they beat him for his insolence, locked him in the basement for 3 days, and ordered him to forget he ever had sisters. But Thomas couldn't forget. As the beatings intensified and still no information came, he escaped without hesitation. At 18, he was technically an adult, and the school's half-hearted search lasted only a few days. There were no missing persons announcements, no real police investigation, just the silent understanding that another native boy had vanished into America's vastness, and no authority truly cared. For 40 years, he wandered the Southwest in his van, following rumors and whispers, showing that newspaper photograph to anyone who would look. He survived on odd jobs, construction work when his back allowed, small repairs for cash, occasional handouts from veteran shelters, though he had never served in the military himself. Whisper Rock had been his home for the last decade, not because he had found any trace of his sisters, but because he had finally given up. The town was dying, just like him, and it seemed a fitting place to await the end of his journey. The beer bottle made a dull thud as the last drops disappeared down his throat. Thomas cursed under his breath, carefully folded the newspaper, and placed it back on the passenger's seat, where it always lay, like a silent witness to his suffering. His hands grew steadier when he drank, steadier when the memories weren't so sharp, when the pain dulled. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, listening as the engine coughed like an old man clearing his throat before his last breath. The liquor store was only a 10-minute drive, the only one in this weary town, and Martha, as always, was working behind the counter. The bell above the door jingled as Tommy entered, and Martha Dane looked up from behind the counter with a smile that held genuine warmth and compassion. She was in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun, and her kind eyes, which had seen enough of life, understood suffering without judgment. "Tommy," she said, a slight Spanish accent in her voice. "Let me guess. Out of beer again?" He offered a weak smile in return. Martha was one of the few in Whisper Rock who treated him like a person, not just another drunk native man to be avoided. Their friendship had developed slowly over the past few years, built on small conversations and mutual respect. "You know me too well, Martha," Tommy replied, heading to the cooler at the back of the store. He selected 6 bottles of the cheapest beer and carried them to the counter. As he reached for his wallet, Tommy's heart sank with anxiety. The crumpled bills in his pocket amounted to less than half of what he needed. He had completely forgotten about the money spent on gas last week, and his next disability payment wasn't due for another 5 days. Martha watched him count the bills, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Tommy," she said softly, her voice full of care, "you look sick and tired. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Tommy shrugged, embarrassed by his obvious poverty and how alcohol had become the center of his existence, his only solace. "Money's tight right now. I'll be back when my check comes in." But Martha leaned forward, clasping her hands on the counter, her gaze perceptive and understanding. "I know you're having a hard time dealing with what you're dealing with. I've seen the newspaper you carry, seen the pain in your eyes that never fades." She paused, then continued, her voice softer. "Maybe, just maybe you could come with me to church this Sunday. It looks like it wouldn't hurt you." Tommy's first instinct was to refuse. He had studied Catholic teachings at the boarding school, memorized countless prayers and biblical passages, but had never found solace in religion. Moreover, Christianity reminded him of everything that had been taken from him, of the violent suppression of his culture and identity. He had also long abandoned his traditional Navajo spirituality, feeling disconnected from both worlds, lost between them. "Church isn't a place for someone like me, Martha," he said quietly, his voice heavy with weariness. "I'm not religious, and I don't think your God would want to see me there." But Martha's eyes sparkled with determination, a twinkle lighting them up. "Tell you what," she said, her voice taking on a playful note, "if you come to church with me and stay for the whole service, I'll buy you those 6 bottles of beer. And if you're still not convinced it helped, I'll throw in 2 more." Tommy looked at her skeptically, his eyebrows raised. You're trying to bribe me with alcohol to go to church? Doesn't that go against Catholic rules or something? Martha laughed. The sound of her laughter was like the ringing of silver bells, light and clear. Maybe so, she admitted with a smile. But sometimes God works in mysterious ways. And sometimes people need practical incentives to open their hearts to possibilities they hadn't considered, and to find comfort where they least expected it. The offer from Martha's lips was truly tempting, more than just appealing. 8 bottles of beer in exchange for 1 church service seemed like a perfectly reasonable deal, especially since he had no other plans for that Sunday. Martha's sincerity, her genuine concern, was something hard to ignore. All right, Tommy finally said, his voice sounding a bit uncertain. But I want to be clear, I'm doing this for the beer, not for my soul's salvation. Martha's smile widened, lighting up her face. At least that's honest. Service starts in 30 minutes at the parish of the Holy Martyrs of the Desert. It's not far from here. Just follow the main road towards the mountains and turn left at the large wooden cross. She paused, then added with a slight smirk, Can you stay sober for 30 minutes? Tommy thought about asking for at least 1 beer now to calm his nerves, but something in Martha's expression made him reconsider. All right, I'll meet you there. Back in his old van, Tommy began searching through his few belongings for something suitable to wear to church. His cleanest t-shirt was still stained and worn, but there was no other option. He splashed water on his face from a plastic jerrycan, ran his fingers through his graying hair, and tried to make himself look at least somewhat presentable. As he drove towards the parish of the Holy Martyrs of the Desert, Tommy wondered what he was getting himself into. The church was a modest building with adobe walls and a simple wooden cross above the entrance. Several cars were parked in the gravel lot, and he saw people in their Sunday best, leisurely walking towards the main doors. Tommy parked his battered van next to a pristine sedan and immediately felt awkward due to the stark contrast. But Martha appeared beside him as soon as he stepped out, her face beaming with welcome. "Thank you for coming, Tommy," she said, gently taking his arm. "I think this is exactly what you need." Inside the parish of the Holy Martyrs of the Desert, daylight streamed through simple stained-glass windows, casting colored shadows on the old wooden pews that had witnessed decades of worship and prayers. The church was modest but well-maintained, with whitewashed adobe walls and a simple wooden altar adorned with fresh desert flowers. Tommy followed Martha to a pew in the back, acutely aware of his worn clothes and the faint smell of beer that likely still clung to him despite his desperate attempts to tidy himself. He sank onto the hard wooden seat, crossing his arms, impatiently waiting for the service to end so he could collect his promised beer. When the congregants stood for the opening hymn, Tommy reluctantly rose to his feet, mumbling words he vaguely remembered from his boarding school days. When they sat, he sat. When they knelt, he remained seated, drawing a few disapproving glances, which he successfully ignored. The priest who approached the altar was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, exuding a sense of calm. "That's Father Murphy," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's been here for 15 years. A good man." Tommy nodded absently, but then something caught his attention. On the other side of the room, just below the altar, stood a group of nuns who seemed different from what he expected. He pointed them out to Martha, who followed his gaze with interest. "Usually, there aren't any nuns there," she whispered back. "And they're wearing different colored habits, longer ones, different from the nuns of this church. It looks like something special is happening today." The nuns wore floor-length black habits, their faces partially obscured by their head coverings. There was something austere about their presence, a severity that uncomfortably reminded Tommy of the boarding school, of those years spent in confinement. But there was something else, too. Most of them appeared to be native women, their features familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with unexpected, surging emotion. Father Murphy's sermon washed over Tommy like background noise, failing to register in his mind. He only caught snippets about faith and perseverance, about how God's plan unfolds in unexpected ways, but his attention was constantly drawn to the nuns standing silently by the altar. There was something almost unnatural in their stillness, as if they were statues rather than living women. As the service neared its end, Father Murphy made an announcement that brought Tommy's attention back. Before we dismiss today, I want to inform everyone of a special opportunity. The Sisters of the Order of the Handmaidens of St. Dina are visiting our church as part of their annual tour of Catholic churches in New Mexico. He paused, surveying the congregants. They're here to offer healing prayers of renewal, and anyone who feels the need for prayer is invited to receive it. Martha gently nudged Tommy. You should go up to the sisters, she said. It will be good for you. Tommy shook his head. Let's go back. I've done my part. Let's go back to the store then. Martha agreed, but as they began to move towards the exit, Father Murphy approached them. He recognized Martha and smiled warmly. Martha, so good to see you. And who have you brought with you today? Martha introduced Tommy, and the priest extended his hand with genuine warmth. It's wonderful to have you here, Thomas. I don't believe I've seen you at our services before. Tommy found himself responding despite his initial intention to remain detached. It's been a long time since I've been at church. Used to do it when I was in boarding school. I've almost forgotten all those biblical teachings, but what you said today gave me some inspiration. Something in Tommy's demeanor prompted Father Murphy to continue the conversation. Perhaps it was the pain that lived in his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly, but the priest seemed to recognize a soul in need of healing and felt deep compassion. As they talked, Tommy found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He confessed his struggles with alcohol, his battles with a pain that never seemed to end, though he carefully avoided mentioning his missing sisters. That wound was too deep, too personal to share with a stranger, however kind he might be. When Tommy finished, the priest spoke quietly about the visiting nuns. The Sisters of the Order of the Handmaidens of St. Dina lead a very strict life, he explained. They are entirely devoted to prayer and Catholic teaching. He paused, then continued. They have taken vows of silence and celibacy and do not interact with the public, except for their month of healing and this annual event when they visit churches throughout New Mexico. He gestured towards the figures in black habits. You don't even need to speak to them. Just write your prayer request on one of the forms, light a candle, and place your request in the box where they are standing. They will pray for these requests when they return to their monastery. The priest added, his voice full of conviction. Then, in a few weeks, they will write responses on the back of the prayer forms to relay God's message. The church will return these papers to you. Tommy, despite himself, pondered this intriguing offer, which seemed almost mystical. So, the nuns will write exactly what God tells them for each individual prayer request. That's right, Father Murphy confirmed. Martha encouraged him again, and Tommy's curiosity grew. He had never heard of anything like this before. Maybe he could ask God about his sisters, about where they might be. It seemed worth a try, especially since it didn't require any real commitment from him. So, he walked to the front of the church, his steps echoing slightly on the tiled floor. At a small table, he found prayer request forms and a pen. His handwriting was shaky as he wrote his name and his request, the words coming from a depth of desperation he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Under the guidance of one of the silent sisters, he lit a candle, its flame dancing in the still church air, casting whimsical shadows. He awkwardly made the sign of the cross, the gesture feeling foreign after so many years away from formal religion, then approached the box where the 5 nuns stood. Up close, he could see that most of the nuns indeed had native features, and the sight filled him with conflicting emotions. It reminded him too vividly of the boarding school, of how native children were forced to participate in the destruction of their own culture. But there was something else, a familiarity he couldn't quite place, something that unsettled his soul. The prayer box was almost full, and Tommy had to press his folded form hard to make it fit inside. Having done so, he looked up at the nun standing closest to the box and felt compelled to speak. If you're right about this, he said quietly, his voice filled with hidden hope and despair. If your God is stronger than our traditional spirits, then he should be able to tell me where my 3 missing sisters are. He paused, then added, his voice firmer. If he does, I will be a devout Catholic for the rest of my life." Tommy offered a slight smile, hoping to make a connection with these women who shared his heritage, but none of the nuns smiled back. However, he noticed their expressions shift slightly when he mentioned his missing sisters. There was something in their eyes, perhaps sympathy, but he couldn't interpret it. It was too fleeting. As he turned to walk back to Martha and Father Murphy, Tommy glanced over his shoulder one last time. He watched as the nun who had caught his attention lifted the heavy prayer box to carry it into a side room. She had a noticeable limp, favoring her right leg, and nearly stumbled under the box's weight, her movements unsteady. As she reached the door and opened it, a gust of wind from outside caught her habit, making it billow near her face. For just a moment, Tommy clearly saw her left temple, and his heart almost stopped, skipping a beat. There, partially hidden by her habit, was a thick, raised scar running along her left sideburn. The sight struck Tommy like a physical blow, taking his breath away. Naomi had a scar in that exact same spot. A reminder of the day she tried to protect little Eva from a particularly cruel nun wielding a wooden ruler. Tommy learned of the incident weeks later, when Naomi whispered the story to him after morning mass, her voice trembling with the memory of pain and fear. Tommy started to call out, his mouth opening to utter his sister's name, but the door closed with a soft click before he could make a sound, and his cry caught in his throat. The moment passed, leaving him standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and disbelief, like a trapped bird. Another sister approached him and silently gestured for him to move along, indicating the small line of people that had formed behind him. Tommy mumbled an apology and forced himself to return to where Martha and Father Murphy waited, his mind reeling from the impossible thought that he had just seen his long-lost sister. Tommy returned to where Martha and Father Murphy stood near the altar, his mind still in turmoil from what he had seen, like the aftermath of a storm. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, his voice slightly unsteady, betraying his inner turmoil. "I saw one of the nuns limping, and it caught my attention, reminded me of something from the past." Father Murphy's expression grew concerned, worry etched in his eyes. "Are you all right? You look pale." Tommy took a deep breath, realizing the moment had come to share what he had held inside for so long, like a heavy stone in his soul. "Father, I need to tell you something. I had 3 sisters, and they disappeared 40 years ago. They were taken from our boarding school, St. Gertrude's Indian Boarding School in Cottonwood Bluffs." The priest's eyes widened with sympathy, his face showing genuine understanding. "Taken? What happened?" "It was 1945, Tommy continued, the words now coming easier as he started, like a dam breaking. "There was a press visit, reporters taking pictures of the school to show how well the assimilation program was working. After that day, my sisters just vanished." He paused, recalling those terrible days. "The school officials wouldn't tell me anything. When I kept asking questions, they beat me and locked me up." He fell silent, gathering his strength to continue the agonizing story. "I checked on the boarding school many years later. It's abandoned now, falling apart, but the pain of losing them has never left me." Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying his inner tension. "We were from a Navajo family. First, we were separated from our father when he was arrested for resisting land seizure. Then I was separated from my sisters." He looked at the priest, his eyes full of despair. "I've been searching for them ever since, but I've never found any trace of where they went." Father Murphy gently placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, offering comfort. "I cannot imagine the anguish you have carried all these years. What guidance are you seeking? How do I forgive?" Tommy asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "How do I move on from all of this? The anger, the loss? I drink to forget, but it never truly goes away." Father Murphy was silent for a moment, carefully considering his words before responding. "Have you ever heard of Abraham from the Bible?" he finally asked. "He waited for decades for God to fulfill his promise of son." The priest continued, his voice calm and steady. "Abraham had to learn patience and faith, even when all seemed hopeless. Sometimes God's timing is not our timing, but his answers do come." The priest gestured towards the front of the church, where Tommy had just submitted his prayer request. "I truly believe you should wait for God's answer to the prayer you just made," he added, his gaze full of conviction. "Many members of my community have received answers from the Handmaiden Sisters, and they have found them remarkably accurate and meaningful. Perhaps this is how God will finally speak to you about your sisters." Tommy felt a spark of hope, but his mind was full of questions that demanded answers. "Father, can you tell me more about these nuns, the Handmaidens of Saint Dina, who founded their order, and why most of them seem to be native women?" Father Murphy's demeanor changed noticeably, his face becoming more guarded. The founder was Father Milford. He passed away many years ago. His son, Father Milford too, continues the ministry now. We are not permitted to speak about it. These are sacred missions. But why are most of the nuns native women? Tommy pressed, unwilling to back down. And where is their monastery? I'd like to visit them to better understand their work. The priest shook his head firmly, his resolve unwavering. I cannot provide information about the location of their monastery. The Handmaiden Sisters are a very private and secluded Catholic missionary group. He continued, his voice becoming more official. They operate what they call a sanctuary for women in prayer and penance. They have taken strict vows of silence and practice extreme modesty. No contact, no visitors. They're completely cut off from the outside world, except for these annual church visits. Tommy sensed that Father Murphy was holding something back, but the priest's body language made it clear the conversation was over. Martha stepped forward, breaking the awkward silence, her smile encouraging. "Well, Tommy, I guess it's time for me to fulfill my part of our bargain," she said with a smile. They said their goodbyes to Father Murphy and headed back to the parking lot. The afternoon heat shimmered over the gravel as they approached their vehicles. "I'll meet you at the store," Martha said, getting into her car. Tommy drove his van through the dusty streets of Whisper Rock, his mind buzzing with everything that had happened, like a boiling cauldron. At the liquor store, Martha kept her promise, handing him 8 bottles of beer with a gentle admonition. "Try not to drink all 8 in one day," she said kindly. "And maybe we could go to church again next week." Tommy nodded absently, his thoughts still consumed by the limping nun and her distinctive scar that so strongly reminded him of Naomi. Back at his van, he noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. He pulled it out and saw it was a flyer announcing the annual church tour of the Handmaidens of Saint Dina, with a schedule of upcoming visits to various churches throughout New Mexico in the coming weeks. Tommy folded the flyer without reading it closely and opened one of his bottles of beer. Starting the van's engine and taking a large gulp, he drove past the parish of the Holy Martyrs of the Desert once more. This time, he saw the 5 nuns exiting the church and getting into a plain white van. A young church volunteer carried several boxes, presumably containing the prayer requests, and loaded them into the back compartment of the van. He pulled out the flyer again, hoping to find the monastery's address, but there was nothing there except instructions to visit churches on their tour schedule for prayer submissions. Curiosity overrode Tommy's initial plan to return to his usual parking spot. Since Father Murphy had refused to disclose the monastery's location, Tommy decided to follow the van and see where these mysterious nuns actually lived. His curiosity was partly fueled by the hope of learning more about the limping nun, but deeper still was a need to understand why so many native women had joined this secluded Catholic order. Perhaps someone there had seen his sisters, or maybe they had even become part of this order. He only hoped these women had found a better life than the one he remembered from the boarding school. It was around 1 p.m. when Tommy began to follow the van as it left Whisper Rock. He kept a significant distance, maintaining several car lengths between them to avoid detection. The van headed east towards the mountains, and as they moved further from town, the landscape became increasingly desolate, wild, and uninhabited. Sagebrush and yellow grasses stretched towards distant peaks, interrupted only by occasional weathered fence posts or abandoned homesteads, like ghosts of the past. After driving for nearly an hour through this remote terrain, Tommy noticed something unexpected in the distance. It was a large compound, surrounded by a chain-link fence, topped with what appeared to be prayer flags rather than barbed wire. A sturdy gate blocked the entrance, and next to it stood a small guard shack. Tommy pulled off the road and parked behind a cluster of desert bushes, watching as the white van approached the gate. A young native man emerged from the guard shack, stoic and vigilant, suspiciously surveying the surroundings before opening the gate to let the van inside. From his hidden vantage point, Tommy studied the compound. It was nothing like the peaceful monastery he had envisioned. The buildings looked worn and utilitarian, more akin to a prison or a correctional facility than a place for spiritual contemplation. The presence of the fence and an armed guard only reinforced this impression, stirring unsettling associations. As the gate closed behind the van, Tommy remained concealed among the bushes, his beer warming in his hand. As he tried to make sense of what he had seen, like unraveling a complex riddle, Tommy remained parked behind the desert bushes for nearly half an hour, observing the compound for signs of activity and contemplating whether he should approach the guards at the gate. The afternoon sun beat down on the metal roof of his van, but outside the chain-link fence, nothing moved except for the occasional flutter of prayer flags in the hot wind, like silent signals. As he waited, Tommy reached into a small cabinet beside his makeshift bed and pulled out an old wooden cigar box that had traveled with him for 4 decades, holding secrets of the past. The box was smooth from handling, its corners rounded, and its finish faded to a dull brown, like old leather. Inside lay the few precious items he had managed to salvage from his former life, fragments of an identity the boarding school could not destroy. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The first item was a collection of fragile school photographs, their edges cracked and yellowed with age, like old leaves. Most of them showed groups of children in uniform, their faces serious and detached, devoid of childish spontaneity. But there was one photograph he cherished above all others. It was a candid shot of his 3 sisters sitting together on the dormitory steps, taken by a sympathetic kitchen worker who had secretly passed it to him. Beneath the photographs lay his most precious treasure, a turquoise pendant set in silver, suspended from a leather cord that had grown soft and dark with wear. Tommy carefully lifted the pendant, feeling its familiar weight in his palm, like a part of himself. His father had made 4 identical pendants, one for each of his children, the winter before they were taken. The turquoise was a deep robin's egg blue, with veins of darker stone running through it like ancient rivers carrying their waters through the ages. Tommy turned the pendant over and traced the engraved Navajo symbols on the back with his fingertip. Ashkenazi, he whispered, speaking his true name, etched in a traditional script that connected him to generations of ancestors. His father had once told him the pendant would protect him and help him remember who he truly was, no matter how far he strayed from his native home. The last item in the box was a folded sheet of paper that, at first glance, looked like ordinary refuse, but to Tommy, it held immeasurable value. It was an old lunch menu from the boarding school kitchen, printed on cheap paper that had miraculously survived 40 years of careful handling. But it wasn't the menu itself. What mattered was what Tommy had sketched on its back during one of his many sleepless nights in the dormitory. The pencil sketch was faded but still remarkably clear. His 3 sisters in a moment of rare tenderness, with Naomi gently braiding Eva's long hair and Sarah sitting nearby, her mouth open in song. Tommy was gifted at drawing, and these sketches were his only escape from the harsh realities of boarding school life. He had created this image from memory after an evening when he caught a glimpse of his sisters together during chapel service, and it captured a moment of love and sisterhood that the school's strict discipline could not entirely suppress. Now, comparing the sketch to his memory of a limping nun in the church, Tommy felt his heart beat faster, anticipating something incredible. The eyes were the same shape. The mouth had the same gentle curve. And, most importantly, it was the distinctive scar on her left temple. Naomi had gotten that scar protecting little Eva from a particularly cruel nun who hit her with a wooden ruler. The wound had healed poorly, leaving a thick, raised mark that no amount of time could erase. His deep reflection was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the compound gates opening. Tommy looked up and saw a small, unassuming sedan exiting the facility. As the gates swung open, he caught a glimpse of the inner courtyard. Two figures in black habits stood near the main building, and even from this distance, Tommy could see they were embracing. One of them appeared to be wiping her eyes, while the other gently patted her back in a comforting gesture. Before Tommy could process what he was seeing, a third figure, someone in regular clothes, appeared and firmly directed both nuns back towards the building. The gates closed with a metallic clang, cutting off his view. Tommy frowned, disturbed by what he had witnessed. Why were nuns in a supposed sanctuary crying? He was certain he wasn't drunk. He'd only had half a beer and wasn't hallucinating. The sedan that had left was now disappearing around a bend in the road, too far for Tommy to pursue. Instead, he put the turquoise pendant around his neck, letting it rest on his chest as his father had intended, and climbed out of his van, preparing for further action. The walk to the compound gates took several minutes across the rugged desert terrain, each step kicking up puffs of dust. As he approached, the young Navajo guard emerged from his guard shack, his hand resting casually but meaningfully on what looked like a two-way radio. "You're not allowed here," the guard said firmly, his voice devoid of emotion. "This is private property. No trespassing." Tommy peacefully raised his hands, showing no aggression. "I'm not looking for trouble, brother. I just want to know if this is indeed the monastery for the handmaiden sisters of Saint Dina. I'd like to speak with Father Milford, too." The guard's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering in them. "Who are you and why are you looking for Father Milford? His office isn't here. He's in Santa Dolorosa. Only the sisters live here." Instead of a direct answer, Tommy pulled the turquoise pendant from beneath his shirt, letting it catch the afternoon light. The guard's expression immediately changed as he recognized the traditional Navajo craftsmanship and the sacred symbols carved into the silver setting. They looked at each other for a long moment, two native men standing in the desert, both understanding the deep significance of what hung around Tommy's neck. In Navajo beliefs, turquoise was sacred and protective, a connection to the earth and sky that no cultural suppression could sever. "I can't help you much," the guard finally said, now softer, his voice more human. "Even though you are a brother. If you want answers, you need to speak to Father Milford too directly. His office is in Santa Dolorosa." He pointed towards a mountain road. "Follow this road east for about 30 miles. Don't tell anyone I gave you the address." The guard glanced nervously at the compound buildings, as if fearing he might be overheard. "You need to leave now. This is not a good place for a native man." Tommy started to turn away, but something made him stop. "Brother, are the sisters safe here? I saw some of them in church today. Most were native women, like us. And just now, I saw nuns crying inside your gates. Are they being saved here, or something else?" The guard's face became completely stone, but Tommy saw fear flicker in his eyes, quickly vanishing. "We all play our parts here," he said quietly, his voice strained. "My part is to keep my mouth shut and keep everyone I care about safe. That's all I can tell you." His voice became insistent, almost a command. "Go. I've helped you enough now." Tommy thanked him and walked back to his van, feeling his suspicions only grow stronger. The drive to Santa Dolorosa took Tommy along winding mountain roads, weaving between red rock formations and sparse desert vegetation. As his van climbed to higher elevations, the air grew slightly cooler, though the afternoon sun still beat down relentlessly from above. When he finally reached the outskirts of Santa Dolorosa, a strange sense of recognition washed over him, as if he had been there before. Something about the landscape, the way the buildings nestled at the base of the mountain, triggered a memory from decades long past. As he drove down the main street, his suspicions were confirmed when he noticed several weathered road signs that hadn't been updated, remnants bearing the town's former name, Cielo Seco. Tommy pulled to the side of the road and stared at one of the old signs, memories flooding back like waves. He had been here 20 years ago during his desperate search for his sisters that had taken him across the Southwest. Back then, he had met a kind man, some kind of researcher or scientist, who was collecting plant samples in the mountains. Tommy had been exploring a narrow canyon, following rumors of missing native children, when he almost fell into a deep chasm. The stranger had grabbed his arm and pulled him to safety, likely saving his life. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the few moments of human kindness he had encountered during his long years of searching. But now he pushed it aside, focusing on his current mission. He needed to find Father Milford II's office. Tommy's van was running low on gas, and his wallet barely held enough money to fill the tank for the return trip to Whisper Rock. He considered buying a local map at a gas station, but decided he couldn't afford such an expense. Instead, he stopped at several businesses to ask for directions, describing the address the guard had given him. Nearly an hour of searching and asking later, Tommy finally found the building. It was on a quiet residential street on the outskirts of town, and his heart leaped when he saw the same sedan that had earlier left the compound parked directly in front of it. The building itself was not what Tommy expected for a religious office. Instead of a formal church administrative building, it was a modest, single-story adobe house with a red tile roof, the kind any middle-class family in the area might own. Tommy parked his van across the street and studied the sedan. Through its windows, he could see that the car was empty, though the engine hood indicated it had recently been driven. He touched the turquoise pendant on his neck for courage and approached the front door of the house. His plan was simple and straightforward. Ask Father Milford II directly about the native women in his monastery. If the priest had been working with native communities for years, perhaps he had heard something about the 3 sisters who had disappeared from the boarding school decades ago. It was a risky move, but Tommy had learned to pursue every possible lead, leaving no stone unturned. He knocked firmly on the wooden door, expecting someone to answer. Instead, the door shifted slightly under the pressure of his knock, opening a few inches. The house was unlocked. "Hello," Tommy called out, pushing the door wider. "Father Milford, I'm here about the monastery. Can we talk?" There was no response from inside the house. Tommy hesitated, knowing he was technically trespassing, but something about the situation felt wrong, triggering an alarm. The unlocked door and the complete silence all portended trouble. He stepped inside, continuing to call out as he found himself in a modest living room with simple furniture and religious artwork on the walls. That's when he noticed the dirty streaks on the floor. Long smears of dirt and dust that led from the front door deeper into the house, as if someone had been dragged. "Hello, is anyone here?" Tommy called again, following the muddy trail down a narrow hallway. The streaks were accompanied by what looked like red scratches on the white walls, marks that could have been left by fingernails clawing at something in a desperate struggle. The trail led him through the house to a back door that was ajar, opening to the wilderness behind the property. Just outside, carved into the natural rock formation of the mountainside, was a staircase leading down into what appeared to be an underground cellar or cave. Such a space might be used for wine storage, Tommy thought at first, but then he heard sounds that made his blood run cold. A woman's voice was crying and pleading, a sound like the crack of a whip or a leather strap. And beneath it all, a man's voice, reading biblical passages in a tone that was both fervent and menacing. "The Lord will punish the wicked and cast down false gods," the voice chanted, full of fanatical conviction. "Discipline purifies the soul and defeats the pagan spirits that corrupt the faithful." Tommy crept closer to the cave entrance, his heart pounding like a drum. Through the stone entrance, he could see flickering candlelight and movement, shadows dancing on the uneven walls like ominous specters. The woman's screams grew more desperate, punctuated by the sounds of blows that echoed through the underground chamber. When Tommy saw a figure moving at the cave entrance, someone in religious robes ascending the stairs, he realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than he had imagined. This was not a holy place of prayer and contemplation. This was a place of torture and violence, where suffering was commonplace. Tommy turned and ran, moving as quickly and quietly as possible back through the house and out the front door. His hands trembled as he started his van and drove away, his mind feverishly processing the implications of what he had seen. He needed help, and he needed it immediately. The police station was easy to find, a small building just off the main street, with 2 patrol cars parked outside. Tommy pulled into the parking lot, took a deep breath, and prepared to report perhaps the most important information of his life. Tommy burst through the doors of the Santa Dolorosa police station, his heart still pounding from what he had seen at Father Milford's house, like a trapped bird. The small building smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Two officers sat at metal desks, looking up with mild annoyance at the interruption to their routine. "I need to report a crime," Tommy gasped. "There's a woman being tortured in an underground cellar at Father Milford II's house. I heard screams, sounds of whipping. Someone needs to go there right now." The older officer, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a sheriff's badge, looked Tommy up and down with obvious disdain, assessing his appearance. "Easy there, Chief. What's your name, and what exactly are you claiming happened?" Tommy quickly explained what he had seen at the modest house, describing the dirty streaks, the red scratches on the walls, and the horrific sounds emanating from the underground chamber. As he spoke, he saw the officers' expressions grow increasingly skeptical, their eyes conveying disbelief. "You smell of alcohol," the sheriff interrupted, wrinkling his nose. "How much have you had to drink today?" "I had one beer a few hours ago," Tommy countered, his voice filled with desperation. "That's not the point. There's a woman being hurt in there right now, and you need to hold on," the younger officer interjected. "Are you talking about Father Milford II, the Catholic priest?" "Yes, look, I know how it sounds, but I saw." The sheriff stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger, as if suffused with blood. "Now you listen to me, crazy Navajo. Father Milford II is one of the most respected men in this town. He wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone torture someone. And those nuns you're rambling about, they're all safe in their monastery in the mountains. No one's ever seen them in town, let alone in some underground cellar." Tommy felt his desperation rising, like a wave engulfing him. "Please, just send someone to check the house. It'll take 5 minutes to be sure." "That's a pretty serious accusation you're making here," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a menacing tone. "You're talking about breaking and entering private property, making defamatory statements against a man of God. You admit you entered his house without permission. I can detain you right now for trespassing." "I didn't break in," Tommy insisted. "The door was unlocked, and I heard someone in distress. Don't you have a duty to investigate?" The sheriff walked to a shelf along the wall where religious items were displayed. A wooden cross, a statue of the Virgin Mary, rosary beads, and several framed photographs. He picked up 2 photos and handed them to Tommy. "This is Father Milford, the founder of the mission," the sheriff said, pointing to the first photo. "Died about 15 years ago. And this is his son, Father Milford II, who continues his father's holy work." Tommy's blood ran cold as he stared at the second photograph. The face looking back at him was unmistakably the same man from his cherished newspaper clipping, the priest who had stood behind his 3 sisters on the chapel porch 40 years ago. He was older now, with graying hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but definitely the same man. "This town has been blessed with peace ever since Father Milford II received a revelation that God wanted us to change our name from Celico to Santa Dolorosa," the sheriff continued reverently. "We've had the lowest crime rate in the county ever since. This man is practically a saint." Tommy realized with growing horror that the local law enforcement effectively worshipped Father Milford II. Any accusation against the priest would be automatically dismissed, regardless of the evidence. The sheriff's voice became cold and final. "I'm warning you for the last time. Leave this town and don't come back. If you make another crazy accusation like that, I'll detain you for disturbing the peace and filing false reports. Get out of here before I change my mind about letting you go." Tommy left the police station, his hands trembling with adrenaline and frustration, as if after a hard battle. In his van, he tried to calm his breathing and think clearly. The local authorities were useless. Worse, they were blinded by devotion to the priest. He needed help from someone he could trust. Tommy drove to the nearest gas station and found payphone. From his glove compartment, he pulled out a worn address book he had carried for years and flipped through the pages until he found the right number. Clyde Yazzie, the researcher whose life he had saved 20 years ago in these very mountains. With trembling fingers, Tommy dialed the number and waited for an answer, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Yazzie residence. Clyde, it's Tommy Thomas Red Elk. We met about 20 years ago near Cielo Seco. You were doing some research in the mountains then. I'm not sure if you remember me. There was a tense pause. Tommy, my God, where are you calling from? Are you still in the area? I'm in Santa Dolorosa. I realized they changed the name from Cielo Seco. Clyde, I need your help. I'm still looking for my sisters, and I think I've found something. There's a Catholic priest named Father Milford, too, and I saw him torturing a woman in an underground cellar at his house. Clyde's voice turned skeptical, disbelief creeping in. Tommy, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure about what you saw? I'm absolutely serious. I heard a woman screaming, sounds of whipping, and this priest reading biblical verses about punishing heathens. When I tried to report it to the local police, they completely dismissed me. They worshiped this priest, told me to leave town or they'd arrest me. Look, I don't know, Clyde. Tommy interrupted him, his voice growing more desperate, almost pleading. 20 years ago, you were collecting plant samples near that canyon system. I grabbed your arm when you almost fell into a chasm. I saved your life. You told me if I ever needed anything, I could call you. Well, I'm calling in that debt now. The line was silent for a long moment. When Clyde spoke again, his tone was completely different, filled with resolve. Where are you now? The gas station on the main road, through Santa Dolorosa, the Chevron station. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't move. True to his word, Clyde arrived quickly in a dusty pickup truck. He was older, his hair mostly gray, and his face weathered by 2 decades of southwest sun, but Tommy recognized him instantly. Clyde got out of his truck and walked over to the payphone where Tommy was waiting. Tell me everything, Clyde said without preamble, his voice serious. Tommy recounted the entire story. The church service, the limping nun with the distinctive scar, following the van to the compound, the encounter with the guard, and finally, witnessing the torture at Father Milford's house. As he spoke, he watched Clyde's expression change from skepticism to concern and then to outright alarm, as if all of Tommy's emotions were reflected on his face. The local police won't help because they're essentially in this priest's pocket, Tommy concluded. When I saw his picture at the police station, I recognized him from the newspaper photo I've carried for 40 years. He's the same priest who was at my sister's boarding school the day they disappeared. Clyde nodded grimly, his face serious. You're right about the local police. They won't help 2 Navajo men make accusations against a respected Catholic priest, but we have other options. We need to contact the Navajo Nation Police Department. They have jurisdiction when crimes involve tribal members, and they can force local authorities to act. Do you know anyone there? My cousin Joe works for the tribal police. He handles liaisons with local law enforcement. Let me give him a call. Clyde went into the gas station to make the call while Tommy waited outside, pacing nervously. The sun was beginning to dip towards the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Every minute that passed meant more potential suffering for whoever was in that underground chamber. 15 minutes later, Clyde emerged, his face grim. Joe's on his way with a team, he said. He said a situation like this, involving religious institutions and missing tribal members, warrants immediate investigation. They'll meet us at the priest's house, but he warned us to stay clear, stay hidden, and let them handle it. We're going back there. We have to be witnesses. And if that woman is actually your sister, Clyde left the sentence unfinished, hanging in the air. I'm not sure, Clyde, whether she's my sister or not, but she needs help. They decided to take Clyde's pickup truck instead of Tommy's conspicuous van. As they drove back towards Father Milford's house, Tommy felt his heart pounding in his chest, anticipating the climax. After 40 years of searching, he might finally get answers, though the circumstances were more horrific than anything he could have imagined. They parked behind a cluster of desert scrub about 100 yards from the house, positioning themselves to observe while remaining unseen. The same sedan was still parked out front, and lights were visible through the windows. There, Clyde whispered, pointing towards the house. 2 men in white linen robes, the kind worn by members of some religious orders, were carrying a lifeless figure towards the sedan. Even from a distance, Tommy could see that the woman was dressed in a black nun's habit. Her head rested limply on one of the men's shoulders, and dark stains were visible on both her habit and the men's white robes. "Blood," Tommy breathed, his voice filled with horror. "Look at her face." The woman's nose and cheeks were bloody, and she appeared barely conscious. The men struggled with her weight as they approached the car, clearly intending to transport her somewhere. Before they could load her into the vehicle, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the desert air, shrill and alarming. The two men froze, looking around frantically as 3 vehicles appeared on the road: 2 Navajo Nation Police Department patrol cars and 1 unmarked SUV. "That's Joe," Clyde said, pointing to a tall man exiting the lead vehicle. Tommy and Clyde emerged from their hiding spot and approached the scene. Clyde pointed Tommy out to his cousin, a serious-looking man in his 40s wearing a tribal police uniform. The confrontation that followed was tense and chaotic, full of suppressed emotions and open defiance. Father Milford, too, emerged from the house, his face a mask of righteous indignation as he confronted the tribal police officers. He was exactly as Tommy remembered him from the newspaper photograph, though aged and in civilian clothes that appeared stained with blood. "This is private property belonging to the Catholic Church," Father Milford declared, his voice filled with arrogance. "You have no jurisdiction here. This woman is a member of our religious community, receiving spiritual guidance. Sir, we have reports of assault and possible kidnapping involving tribal members," Joe responded firmly, his voice unwavering. "We need to speak with this woman and inspect the premises." Minutes later, the local Santa Rosa police arrived, forced to respond to the presence of tribal authorities. The sheriff, who had earlier dismissed Tommy, looked humiliated to be caught in the middle of a jurisdictional conflict involving his beloved priest. Father Milford continued to protest, claiming religious sanctuary and insisting the underground chamber was merely a wine cellar for Holy Communion. But as the tribal police officers helped the injured woman out of the car, her condition became undeniable. She was too weak to stand. Blood covered her face, and her habit was torn and soiled, evidence of brutal treatment. Tommy stepped closer, his heart pounding as he studied the woman's face. Despite her injuries and the 4 decades that had passed, he recognized her instantly. The distinctive scar on her left temple, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her mouth even in pain, all marked her as a familiar person. "Alisai," he called, using her Navajo name. "Naomi." The woman's head weakly turned at the sound, and as her eyes managed to focus on Tommy's face, she gasped. Breaking her vow of silence for the first time in 40 years, she uttered in a broken voice, "Brother Ashki Yazi Tommy." Everyone present, the police, the tribal authorities, even Father Milford, stared in shocked silence. Tommy stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "This is one of my 3 missing sisters," he announced to the assembled group. "She disappeared from St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school 40 years ago." Emergency medical services were immediately called. Police and tribal officers searched the house and the underground chamber, returning 20 minutes later with Father Milford and his 2 assistants in handcuffs. As the priest was led to the patrol car, he turned to Tommy with venomous hatred in his eyes. "Your false ancestral gods are powerless against the true faith," he spat, his voice filled with fanaticism. "Your pagan beliefs corrupt the pure souls I was trying to save." An officer firmly placed a hand on Father Milford's head and pushed him into the back seat before he could say anything else. When a medical team arrived, they began to examine Naomi with her consent. "From this moment on, I am no longer a nun," she told them firmly, her voice filled with determination. "Do what needs to be done." The paramedics found fresh whip marks on her back, arms, and legs. These were clear signs of prolonged, systematic abuse. As Naomi was given 4 fluids, Joe approached Tommy and Clyde, who stood near the ambulance. "We searched that underground chamber," Joe said, his face grim. "It's deeply disturbing. There was communion wine, and it seems he was forcing her to drink it while beating her. But that's not the strangest part," Joe continued. Naomi, hearing this, nodded weakly. He made us drink wine to open our souls to receive divine messages. When we couldn't give the answers he wanted, he punished us. There's a large statue of the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus, Joe went on. But there's also a small setup for traditional Navajo spiritual rituals. It's like he was mixing native beliefs with Catholicism. Naomi confirmed this with a bitter laugh. We were forced to provide answers to individual prayer requests, like the one you submitted at the church. He believed that Native women had a special connection to the spiritual worlds and communicated better with the Virgin Mary. Clyde shook his head in disgust. That's wrong on so many levels. Only the Native nuns were beaten. Naomi continued, her voice growing clearer. The white nuns were never touched. He would give us wine and make us meditate while intoxicated, claiming it would help us receive visions. She paused, her gaze hardening. When I refused to drink, wanting to stay sober to receive genuine messages from God, he punished me severely. Tommy squeezed his sister's hand. What about Sarah and Eva? Are they safe? They learn to play by his rules, Naomi said quietly. They're still at the monastery. She added, her voice filled with weariness. They've been faking spiritual messages for years to avoid punishment, just like everyone else. She fell silent, lost in the weight of her memories. It's easier to figure out what answers people are looking for when they've written down their prayers, she added, her voice full of experience. Tommy nodded, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. I think I might have seen them at the compound gates. 2 women crying, he said, uncertainty in his voice. That place didn't even look like a monastery when I first saw it. Joe placed a comforting hand on Tommy's shoulder. We're coordinating with state authorities to search the monastery in the mountains. We'll bring Sarah and Eva to you at the hospital. As Naomi was loaded into the ambulance, Tommy climbed in beside her. Clyde followed in his truck as they drove towards the regional hospital, sirens wailing into the desert night, breaking the silence. The waiting room of the regional medical center was a sterile space, filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and the pervasive smell of antiseptic that permeated all hospitals, creating a stifling atmosphere. Tommy sat next to Clyde, both men still processing the magnitude of what had transpired, trying to digest the shocking truth. Naomi was immediately taken to the emergency room upon arrival. The medical team worked quickly to assess her injuries and detoxify her system. A life for a life, Tommy said quietly, looking at his hands. Now you've helped save my sisters. Clyde nodded, remembering. That's how it should be. Navajo brothers help each other when it matters most. They spent the next hour catching up on the decades that had passed. Clyde had continued his botanical research work, eventually settling in Albuquerque with his wife and 2 children. He had always wondered what had become of the desperate man he had saved in the mountains, the one who searched with such fierce determination for his missing sisters. I never stopped looking, Tommy confessed. 40 years of dead ends, false leads, hoping every Native woman I met knew something. He paused, his voice filled with bitterness. Honestly, I'd given up hope. Just sitting in that van in Whisper Rock, just waiting to die. A nurse approached them, a clipboard in her hand. Are you relatives of the patient brought in from Santa Dolorosa? Yes, Tommy said quickly, standing up. How is she? The police are on their way to take a statement, but I can tell you we've successfully detoxified her system with IV therapy. She's conscious and alert now. We're treating her injuries. The nurse continued, her voice calm and professional. She has multiple lacerations consistent with whip marks, some requiring stitches. She'll need time to heal, both physically and emotionally, but her condition is stable. Before Tommy could respond, movement at the hospital's main entrance caught their attention. Joe, the tribal police officer, was entering with 2 women in black habits. Even across the lobby, Tommy recognized them instantly. They were older now, their faces etched with years of hardship, but they were, without a doubt, his sisters. Sarah saw him first. She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears instantly streaming down her cheeks. Eva, the youngest, looked confused for a moment before recognition dawned. All 3 siblings moved towards each other simultaneously, meeting in the center of the waiting room like magnets. Naji, Tommy whispered, using Sarah's birth name, embracing her. Aylin, he said to Eva, holding her tightly. Ashkenazi, Sarah responded through her tears, using his Navajo name. We never thought, never dared to hope. They were all older now. Tommy 58, Sarah in her 50s. Eva approaching 50, but the emotional connection transcended the decades of separation, remaining unbroken. Tommy reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper he always carried, his pencil sketch from the boarding school. Do you remember this? He asked, carefully unfolding the drawing. The sketch showed Naomi braiding Eva's hair while Sarah sat nearby singing, and all three sisters gasped when they saw it. The image captured a moment of tenderness from their childhood that the harsh boarding school regime could not entirely destroy, preserving it in memory. You drew that by candlelight in the dorm, Sarah recalled, her voice filled with tenderness, after evening prayers when the matrons weren't looking. Where's Alisai? Eva asked, using Naomi's birth name, her voice filled with anxiety. Is she okay? She's being treated, Tommy assured them, his voice filled with relief. She's going to be fine. Joe approached them, blending professional duty with personal satisfaction, his face serious. We need to take official statements from everyone, and we need to understand what happened in 1945. He added, his voice becoming more official. State police are coordinating with federal authorities. This case now spans multiple jurisdictions and potential federal crimes. They moved to a private consultation room, where Joe set up a recording device. Tommy and Clyde gave their accounts of the day's events, describing everything from the church service to the rescue at Father Milford's house. Then it was Sarah and Eva's turn to tell their story, which was filled with pain and suffering. What happened that day in 1945? Joe asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath before beginning, gathering her strength. Reporters and government officials arrived at St. Gertrude's to inspect the boarding school. We were scrubbed clean, given decent clothes, some of which were borrowed from white church donors. Eva continued. They lined us up for photographs under the watchful eyes of the priests and nuns. The youngest children drew the most attention because of our innocence and wide-eyed beauty. That's what they called it. The three of us sisters were photographed a lot. After the press session ended, Sarah said, her voice hardening, a touch of bitterness in it. Father Reginald Milford, the first Father Milford, approached us. He was a high-ranking priest, very respected. He told us that God had spoken to him directly and had chosen us as favored daughters of the Holy Mother. Tommy felt sick to his stomach as the pieces of the puzzle finally came together, forming a horrifying picture. He promised to guide us to meet the Virgin Mary herself. Eva added, her voice filled with despair. He said everything we prayed for would be granted, that our salvation was guaranteed if we took vows of celibacy and silence. The boarding school matrons knew about it, Sarah continued bitterly. They led us directly to Father Milford after the photographers left. We were scared, but we had been taught to be obedient. We followed him through back corridors to a basement prayer room. Joe's expression grew even grimmer as he listened to this horrific tale. What happened next? That same night, Father Milford drove us in an unmarked church car to a compound near what was then called Cello Secco, Sarah said. He left us with a cloistered order of Catholic nuns who answered to no one but their own leadership and benefactors. What was her treatment like at the monastery? Joe asked. Eva's voice became flat, emotionless, as if she were recounting someone else's story. We were taught a disciplined Catholic life. No talking, constant prayer. When we made even one mistake, we had to strip naked in front of Father Milford while he told us we were sinful and had to beg God for forgiveness. He would whip us himself, saying it was like the scourging of Christ. We made many mistakes when we were young, Sarah added. The punishments were daily. Father Milford took different young nuns for these correctional sessions every day. As we grew older and were indoctrinated into the silent life, we learned to avoid his attention. But he still used us in other ways. Eva continued, we were forced to pray for countless requests from clients, companies, people in high places who paid for spiritual guidance. We had to drink wine and perform altered Navajo rituals, then write down any divine messages we supposedly received. Joe looked up from his notes. This was tied to maintaining the operation's financial support. Yes, Eva confirmed. The blend of native spirituality and Catholicism attracted wealthy benefactors who believed they were receiving more powerful prayers. Tommy listened with growing horror, his heart aching with pain. But one question burned in his mind. Why was none of you ever found? I searched for 40 years. Joe answered that. In 1945, racial discrimination was legalized. Local authorities didn't care about missing Native girls. Boarding schools routinely transferred children without notification, and tribal voices were systematically ignored. Your sisters were never officially adopted, transferred, or reported missing. The school falsified their records, Joe continued. They claimed the girls had been reunited with family, meaning they were supposedly placed with a white Christian family. Since your parents were dead and your father incarcerated, no one had the authority or resources to challenge the official narrative. I kept this newspaper photo all these years, Tommy said, pulling out the worn clipping. I suspected the journalists, the boarding school officials, random predators who might have seen the article. I never suspected the priest himself. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her face calm and professional. The patient in room 12 is asking for her family. She's ready for visitors. They found Naomi sitting up in bed, looking fragile but alert. Her wounds had been cleaned and bandaged, and in 4 in her arm delivered fluids and medication. When she saw all 3 of her siblings together, she began to cry again, tears streaming down her face. I can't believe this day has come, she whispered as they gathered around her bed. Tommy took her hand. We were so close this morning at the church. You were standing right there by the prayer box. If only I had known. Naomi squeezed his fingers. God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Whether it's the Catholic God or our ancestral spirits, or both, they brought us back together. She looked at Tommy, her eyes filled with deep meaning. You got your prayer answered, Tommy, not in words written on paper, but in action. Eva looked thoughtful, her gaze distant. I still believe in Catholic teachings, she said quietly. But these people, Father Milford and his followers, they perverted everything they claimed to represent, even contradicted their own teachings. She paused, then added with bitterness. They used religion to justify violence and exploitation. Tommy nodded slowly, his face etched with deep contemplation. Maybe after you all heal, we can find a right path together. There must be a form of faith that doesn't require us to abandon our identity as Navajo people. He looked at his sisters, his eyes filled with hope. But right now, I'm convinced that God, however we understand him, has answered my prayer. As the 4 siblings sat together in the hospital room, 3 generations of trauma and separation finally beginning to heal, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in 40 years. Hope for the future and the profound peace that comes from answered prayers, like a balm to a wounded soul.